Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. It's my pleasure to introduce you, to welcome you to this book club. I'm Luke. I'm the author of thriller novels. I'm a bit of a podcaster, a writer, a traveler, all these sorts of things as well. So I'm looking forward to talking books with you today. And I'm hosting this event today where we're talking about Chris's first book, his travel memoir. I suppose you could call it a travel memoir, couldn't you? And that's what you'd sort of genre that it fits into.
Yeah, barely, I think, but yeah, it is sort of vaguely in that sphere. Certainly not a traditional.
I absolutely love talking about books. As being a writer myself, we can just talk about the process behind it and how you sort of grab hold of that elusive muse and all these sorts of things. So we'll get into that in a moment. First of all, let me just introduce myself, give you a bit of a description of what we're doing today. So as you know, this is the Nomadic Network. We're a travel community dedicated to helping people travel cheaper, longer and better and more. And we host tons of presentations, virtually and in-person events around the US and some here in the UK and across Europe, and these monthly book clubs. This is my first book club that I've done, although I've attended a couple. I've been in the audience for a couple. So just whilst we get warmed up, whilst we get some people joining us, if they might be a little bit late, find the chat box and tell us where you're coming from. That's the important thing, because we're sort of an international group. I love to hear that people are coming from all around the world, and I love to think, it's so exciting to see someone coming from various parts of the States and Europe and Mexico and Africa and Asia and all that. I absolutely love it, and I'll do some shout outs and read out a couple of those in a moment. So this event is a little bit different from the others. With the normal events that you might have attended here, we try and make this a bit cozy, a bit informal. You know, I'm going, Chris, a bit like the sort of fireside chat. Do you know what I mean? You and I sat around a campfire talking books somewhere in the world. That's the vibe I'm going for today. How do you feel about that?
That's, I got my slippers on, I got my tea here, I'm sitting on the couch. So yeah. that is precisely the vibe that I'm going for.
Wonderful. That's just what I want to hear. Okay, let me tell everyone a little bit about you, Chris, and then we'll get started with some questions, and we'll just sort of, I'm interested to get into this book. So Chris is a budget traveler, full-time writer, and an amateur prepper from Canada. After spending over a decade backpacking the world, Chris compiled his tales of misadventures into the hilarious memoir, The Dogs of Nam. While still an avid traveler and travel writer, these days, he focuses on fiction, and his debut novel, The Less Year, is a gritty and grim coming-of-age adventure and the first book of an action-packed trilogy. And that's out tomorrow. Or, in fact, we've just spoken about this. The paperback is out now. We'll talk about that in a minute. You might know Chris from his role as director of content for nomadicmap.com for the last 6 years. He's currently based on a small island in rural Sweden with his partner, rescue dog, blind cat, and newborn son. Chris, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah. Really excited to talk today. This book, as we were saying, this book came out a few years ago, but I revisited it during the pandemic since I couldn't really go anywhere. So it was nice to sort of give it another read, and now it's sort of gotten another sort of go around with this book club. So yeah, I'm excited to chat and hear what people think, for better and for worse. So don't hold back.
I'm really interested in this because I have done a lot of traveling and have put some of those travels into fiction, but I've never written a non-fiction travel book. And now you've written both, I suppose, although your fiction isn't so sort of travel focused. How is that process different, or how did you find that process different?
I will say that writing a travel memoir, or writing non-fiction, is way easier, simply because I just have to remember something and then write it down. It's like, oh, this happened, and then I write it down. Obviously, you have to edit and polish and make it into a story, but I don't have to create anything. Maybe I'll embellish some things here and there, but like, I'm not creating a whole person or a whole world and then a plot. It's in that sense, it's way easier. Where it's tricky is like in fiction, I can make up whatever wild stories to get your attention. and murder people and blow stuff
Yeah,
up.
that's right.
Significantly less blowing stuff up, significantly less murder in my day-to-day life. So trying to keep people's attention, that's sort of a bit trickier. And so you not only have to have some skill with writing in that regard, but you have to have done some at least mildly interesting things that you can sort of embellish or share.
And how did you? That's it, isn't it? You talk about the mildly interesting, and your book's far more than mildly interesting. You're being, there's some fascinating stories there from the travels. How did you decide which ones went in and which ones didn't?
Yeah, so there are definitely some stories that didn't go into the book because they were too inappropriate,
Right.
And considering what's in the book, maybe that gives people an idea of just the kind of like crazy weird stuff that didn't make the cut. Those are, if we ever have an in-person event or something like that, that's when I'll share some of those. But yeah, they're not certainly not family friendly. And then other ones were just like neat stories that maybe I could have put in, but it was once I sort of went through like what are my most fun ridiculous stories, like that was like that made it easy. That was like most of the book right there. And then I had to sort of pick and choose which ones I liked or didn't like. And it was mostly just like which could I write about in a way that would be interesting to you guys, because they're all interesting to me because like they happened to me. But like which can I sort of frame in at least somewhat of like a funny sort of anecdote or narrative. And those are the ones I ended up with.
I like it. When did you decide that you were gonna immortalize your travels in this way, and you weren't gonna do a YouTube channel or do a podcast or do have one of those glossy Instagram accounts that shows you in front of all the exciting places? Why did you choose literature as your form?
Yeah, I mean, to me, because it was what I'll say it was the easiest, but I mean that in like the sense it was easiest for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a particularly great photographer. I'm not particularly suave on camera. So, by default, it was like, well, what am I left with? And I am a somewhat competent writer. So I was like, I'll go with that. And because at the time I had a travel blog, just sort of a hobby kind of part-time blog, and some of these stories were already there in different forms or shorter forms. And so, I kind of already had some of the building blocks that I sort of poached from there and then expanded upon. But for me, it was like, I just wanted, because I have like several hard drives of photos from like all my trips. And so every now and then I'll just like go through a whole trip and like sort of like a walk down memory lane, which I'm sure a lot of folks here do as well. And that brings back a lot of details for me. But like, it's less fun to go through and like read my journal from the time, because like those stories aren't polished. Today I went here and there, and then this person got sick on the bus, and so it's not. It brings me back, but not in like not in kind of the same way that a book would. So I thought, I want like a photo album of my stories, and so that's kind of why I wrote the book. It's just so that I have something to like look back on whenever I want to sort of walk down memory lane. And the fact that other people got to read it and enjoy it, that's sort of entirely separate from why I did it.
Yeah, I really feel that. And I love that with some of my writing as well. I feel that to revisit it, I'm almost revisiting the trips that inspired that thing. So it's almost like it made the trip last longer in a strange way.
Yeah. Well, there's I forget who talks about it, but memories pay dividends. So when like you do something in life, and when you remember it later and still get sort of whatever feelings from that trip, that's kind of like an investment. So the more sort of experiences you have, whether that's traveling or otherwise, and later in life, those pay dividends. So that's kind of why people always say like, oh, like pay for experiences, not stuff, because that stuff will be long gone. But in 20 years, when I'm older and grayer and balder, I'll still have like the stories that I can look back on, and then they'll still make me laugh. So it's an investment, I say.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's more than that to an extent, because what you've done there is you've not just captured the place, but you've captured the place at that time with you in it. And there's a couple of the great books that are the great travel books that I have read. I love the fact that they capture a place that doesn't really exist anymore, because it was Kathmandu in the 70s, or it was Hong Kong in the 80s, or so and so in the 90s. It's and as much as I could want to visit that place, it would be different now. So you've captured that as you say, a snapshot in time, as some kind of moment for your own, for yourself and for other people.
Yeah, and some of these places I've been back since, and some of them I've thought about it. One of the big trips from the book that my partner and I went on in 2012 was a trip across Russia. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of saying like, oh, like at the 10-year anniversary or 15-year anniversary, we should redo that trip. Now, obviously, I don't think that's going to work out with the current geopolitical events. But it's I'm always interested in going back to places and seeing what they're like, because they're not going to be different. And so as long as you know that going in, you won't be disappointed. And like, traveling across Russia or any country in like 2012 without internet or anything like that is going to be way different than how you do it now. So you'd have a completely different trip, for better or for worse. And so that's definitely something I'd be interested in doing, for some of these destinations, at least.
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it would be really interesting to sort of have that as so. And you quite often, you see people following in the footsteps of great travel writers, don't you? I can think of many programs where someone has taken one of the writings of Marco Polo or whoever, and they've talked about, where they've gone and they've revisited the trip. But doing that of your own trip it would be a very, very fascinating experiment.
yeah I mean, especially now that like I'm older and have a son, like bringing him on some of these adventures I think would have a whole other level of chaos, because he's 1 year old, but also enjoyment, and just sort of seeing how the places have changed, how the world has changed, how the places have changed, and how we've changed going back to them. It's something
How do you, when you are in a place, then if you were thinking, although all those times ago, I'd like to sort of immortalize this in the written word, what were you doing to make sure you remembered those details, or make sure you captured the place really as it was?
So for me, I have a terrible memory, so I take lots of photos. And I just I have a journal, and I'll just jot notes down, random stuff. Whenever I'm on a bus or a plane, I'll just write a little bit what happened, or if I saw anything interesting, and stuff like that. And that's kind of how I remember it. But the biggest and most interesting misadventures aren't the ones that you need to remember. They're the ones sometimes I wish I could forget. So it was just a matter of piecing together some of the little details, and that was just going through photos again and again. And I'm fortunate enough that I have however many terabytes of photos that I could comb through when I was writing, just to sort of get back into what it was like at the time.
Yeah, that's it. And you're putting yourself back in that sort of mindset and making yourself there. That's one of the things I love about writing and the written form, is that it doesn't take anything away from the experience, or it takes very little away from the experience. If you try and do video, it changes the way you visit a place, because you've got to stand behind a camera and do it. If you try and do audio, you've got to stand behind a microphone and do it. If you try and take photos, you've got to crouch down and get the angle. You've got to spend ages in that place you've got to get up at sunrise to get the golden whatever, Whereas a writer, you can just sort of lays around and note things down when you feel you want to do it,
and I think the more you can sort of embed yourself in a place without your phone or anything, or even taking notes, the more time you can spend not doing any of that and just sort of immersing yourself in a destination, I think the better and more interesting experiences you'll have, but also the better that will translate into your writing, because you will have sort of sunk into that more than if you were constantly walking around and taking notes. One thing I will do is just pull out my camera and just as I'm walking around, just film just random kind of B-roll stuff. Because then when I go back, it's like that's kind of immersing me. There's no script, I'm just like filming random streets and people and whatever. But then you can sort of like get a sense of what it was like. I in Vietnam, that was one place I did that a lot because the traffic was insanely hectic for anyone who's been to, somewhere like Hanoi, and where you literally dozens of people die every day just trying to cross the street because it's so hectic. And so like filming stuff like that, and then when you watch it, it really pulls you back into what it was like.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I love the sound of something like that, and how you remember there that you can't walk in a straight line because there's goats on the road and things on the pavement, and the things all up, nothing's level, nothing's it's chaos, isn't it? And it's that sort of thing that photos and other sort of forms don't quite do justice. Is there any go on?
No, I was just saying, I totally agree.
Are there any travel writers that you have read and you feel like your book has gone in the same vein of? Anyone who you sort of have aspired to be? I want to use that loosely, really, because I think as a writer you don't want to replicate, but you stand on the shoulders of someone rather than replicate what they're doing. I think. Yeah,
no, in the sense that like I don't think I'm even remotely as good or talented as any of them, but also I think in many ways my book was trying to do something else, because like most travel writing, good travel writing and great travel writing, it is taking you along a journey, whether that's we're walking the Appalachian Trail or the Silk Road or traveling around Australia. It's a specific adventure in one way or another. And what, for then anybody who works in travel writing, you'll know that like those kind of things often have kind of fabricated experiences. You call ahead to like see if you can get an in on this place, or if you can have a fixer do this thing, and that's fine. It makes for a great story, but it's not something that like the average person is really going to do. Like, if you're going to go to Vietnam and wander around, you're not going to hire a fixer to like get you into special places or like set up interviews with people to learn more about a place. You're just going to walk around and get lost. And so, I wanted to, not to say that those things aren't authentic, but I wanted to sort of show like kind of like a ground eye view of like, here's what traveling is. And there's no grand arc that brings it all together. There's no kind of real point that I'm hitting home. It's just like, here's a mess of events and somehow they're all connected. And this is what it's like when you get out there and travel and sort of stumble around without really knowing what you're doing. Do I wish I was as great a writer as the greats, like a Wolf Potts or a Bill Bryson? Oh, of course. But I'm not sure I could place myself quite in their literary territory.
But I think what you do in this though is you show us, as you said, the real element of travel. And people like Paul Theroux do this. In the first chapter, he leaves his house and he walks to the train station, and then he sits on the train and ends up in Patagonia or Japan or wherever he's going on that particular adventure. And it's really about the idea of illustrating not just what it looks like at the Taj Mahal, but the places in between. The long wait in the airport where you've got nothing but those strange yellow noodles that you don't really understand the flavor of. You can't drink the water, so whatever. All these funny little things that happen to us. The 16-hour wait at a Thai train station where you've no idea which train's yours because it's all in a language you don't read.
Totally.
Then,
yeah.
Yeah,
and I think that's Thoreau's a great example, because I think what a lot of travel writing does is it just showcases, if it's your trek to Machu Picchu, your book's just going to highlight sort of all the main beats of that trip, but there's going to be so much more to it that isn't going to make it into the book because it doesn't really, it slows things down or there's pacing issues or whatever. So when you can throw that out the window, you have much more freedom to what you can write about and include in your book. And since for me, this was sort of a passion project, it wasn't a commercial endeavor. I gave no thought to selling any copies, so I was completely had complete sort of freedom in how I put it all together, and what I put in and what I didn't. And so, yeah, I don't think that's something a lot of writers could do, because they have to try to appeal to a wider audience and sell copies. And so if I was writing a second travel book, I'd probably do some kind of sort of narrative trek adventure like that. Because there is something appealing about that, about like, oh, I'm going to read about this person going on this adventure, and here's the lesson they learned. Like, there's something enjoyable and sort of universal to that kind of travel writing. But I think if doing something similar, but in sort of a fresh, kind of maybe slightly different way, is how I would go about it.
Yeah, I agree with this. But the one thing I like about yours is it's inspiring in the sense that they are quite normal travel experiences, and I don't mean that to belittle the travel at all, but they are the sort of experiences with a couple of $1,000s or pounds or euros or whatever, and a bit of time someone could go and do. And that's what's important. And I think a lot of travel writers can fall in the trap of making something so grand and so big. I'm going to canoe across the Antarctic, that no one's going to want to do that. No one's going to be able to do that. You're putting a barrier between you and the reader in that sense. And people love that, because they love to talk about extreme things in extreme places. But yours is like, it's inspiring in that way. And I think you even say that in the foreword, don't you? You say, like, this is the purpose of the book. I want to encourage you to come and join me on the road.
Yeah. I wanted, from the get-go, I sort of wanted to make it clear, like, what this book is and what it isn't. Because there's a lot of things that it isn't, and I'm happy with that. But yeah, it's to me, it's an invitation. It's like, look, here's all the weird, wonderful stuff that can happen, and not all of it's great. But at the very least, it will make a good story.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Oh, it's been fantastic to ask the questions that I've been that came to my mind when I was reading it. But I can see in the chat we've got loads of people who want to ask their own questions. I would like to invite you, if you've got a question, to put your camera on, give me a wave, and perhaps unmute yourself and ask Chris directly, if you're happy to do that, because I can see some of them are quite wordy, and I'd like you to frame them however you see fit. Is there anyone ready to do that? Yes, Jill, would you like to go first?
At a particular point, and it was in The Ice Cream Man, you talked about feeling your white privilege and being in a place where you really stood out. And I mean, I think probably all of us have felt that. Have you ever, because I haven't, been able to sit down with some of the people that you've met while traveling one-on-one and ask them, how they're seeing you? Because to a certain extent, you kind of assume that I'm white, I'm privileged, and that's how they're seeing me, but maybe they're not, or maybe they're seeing it worse.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Not in Japan, and that's one thing. Like, if I ever win the lottery or just have a bunch of free time, flying back to Kumejima and finding that ice cream guy is like that could be my next book in and of itself. Because because I as soon as you said the ice cream man, it's like I'm back there. And but no, I've certainly I don't think I've had any conversations while traveling. I've had them at home in places with other travelers, at sort of like couch surfing meetups and stuff like that. The conversations come up. In Cambodia, a kid cried when he saw me because he was afraid of white people, and we were out in the sticks and he saw me, and just like the same way like a kid would cry if he saw like a ghost or like some monster. But no, I've never had sort of a conversation about that. Maybe a little bit when I was climbing Kilimanjaro, when we were talking to the our guides about just their lives and stuff like that, and hearing how many times they've climbed the mountain and how little you make, and when they're asking you what you do, and if the money's good, and you're kind of well, you're kind of put in this awkward position where you're comparing your lives, sort of how they stack up on paper. But no, never any sort of like really in-depth conversations about it. It's all sort of been honestly like in hindsight, because I'm pretty clueless in the moment when those things happen, and then when I think about it and overthink about it when I get back, then I'm really start realizing and thinking about it. But yeah, it's certainly, you know, as Luke was saying, like a lot of people could replicate my experiences, but there are definitely going to be people who can't, for better or worse, and specifically in this case, like worse. And like as a straight white guy, I can pretty much go anywhere and do anything, and nobody's really gonna bat an eye. I can fit in, even if I stand out, I'm still fitting in, right? Like oh, there's just a white guy, like that's like a normal background character pretty much almost anywhere you go. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting and sometimes uncomfortable topic to talk about and write about, especially because I'm pretty clueless to all of that stuff in general. You know, I'm not like, I don't have my fingers on the pulse of like what's socially acceptable to talk about and say or do as like a white person, you know. So that whole conversation is certainly interesting, and I think it has to happen in the travel writing sphere, because essentially travel writing up until like 10 years ago was just all straight white people traveling and being and sort of gawking at the world, so to speak. So yeah, I don't think that was much of an answer, but that was my sort of my thoughts on the topic, at least.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Joe.
I know there was Max asked a question in the comments. If you'd like to, if you'd be in a position that you can ask it.
Yes,
Speak.
Max from New Zealand here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah,
indeed.
hey Max.
Okay. It's 6 a.m. here tomorrow, your American time. So as with many of us here, we've been quite lucky to travel in our younger years. But now I can say I can time travel because I'm speaking to you in the future. I have an interesting point of discussion where we all have stories, and you've pointed to some already, that are not printable, but there are some other stories which we feel that they need to be spoken, because you need to check with the audience that they understand the setting to actually not just experience it, but to be able to see what happened to you so they could understand the situation. When you try and put that into words, you have no control over your audience who's reading it. So you don't know if they actually understand the setting. And my discussion point there is that should these things be written? Now, to give an example, I had an opportunity to sleep on the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is a long time ago now, 40 years ago. And the ghosts of the pharaohs rose that night. But it's a story that has to be spoken, not written. So what's the discussion on that?
I mean, I mean, that's the story I want to hear. Like, that's a story I think you have to write. And I mean, that's the thing. Like, when you create anything, whether it's you write a book or a play or whatever, like once you create it and put it out there, it's no longer yours. And so maybe people will read it or listen to it and have the same experiences as you and thoughts, and maybe they'll have something completely different. And that's kind of like the risk of sharing your art or your story or whatever. So yeah, I mean, if it's a story only you want to tell and sort of keep it in that sort of intimate setting, then by all means. But I mean, as soon as you said sleep on the Pyramid of Giza, like that's the opening line to a great story or a book right there, because, you know, that's not something people, I don't think you can do anymore. Ghosts of the Pharaohs aside, that alone is really interesting.
I think you're absolutely right. I love the idea of that. And I think writing offers a sort of anonymity that other forms perhaps don't, because you're not presenting it to that person in a physical way, are you? You can write something completely anonymously should you want to, and no one could know it was you. You could write something and not share it with anyone should you want to, just commit that story to you know, your relatives after you've gone. If you want to, you can put it in an envelope and put it in a safe, and that's there, just recorded for when you're not around anymore. If that's your thing, you don't have to put it out anywhere, and that's I think the beauty of this idea. Yeah, I love that. And I also think it is important in travel writing, Chris, to sort of touch on something you said there, to be honest about the background from which you come, because only then can people make sense of the observations that you're having, aren't they? So you say, this is me, blah blah blah, with all my warts and all my failures, this is what I'm seeing. And I think if you do that and you're honest with that, then no one can ask any more of you. I don't think. Yeah.
It's I think when I was getting ready for this, I was scrolling down the reviews, and one person gave it, I don't know, 2 or 3 stars, and essentially they summed that up. They're like, this is just like a middle-class white guy going on adventures. And I was like, essentially, that's essentially what it is. I mean, like lower middle class technically, but like, yeah, you know, that's what it is. That's all I can. Like, I can't do anything else. Like, I can't not be me. And so, you know, and I don't get, like, I'm not insulted by that. Like, I'm just like, this is, yes, but we need to hear other stories from women and people of color and everyone at every other end of the sort of the spectrum. But I can still only tell my stories, and so that's what I'm gonna do.
Absolutely.
For better or worse.
No, you're absolutely right, and well said there. Jill's got another question here. She says, any thoughts about traveling with a 1-year-old? Are there already some stories percolating? What's your...
I'll be traveling with this 1-year-old on Sunday to Canada, which I'm looking forward to being there. I'm not looking forward to the 9-hour flight. It'll be his first time traveling and my first time traveling with a child. So I'm not looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to like adventures in several years down the road when he can like doesn't have to be carried all the time. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't plan to change my traveling or my travel style, really. You know, I'm not going to all of a sudden start staying at fancy hotels just because there's a baby around. If hostels are good enough for me, hostels are good enough for the baby. But yeah, I look forward to having these adventures with him, to sort of set the tone for like, hey, like traveling should be a normal part of your life. That's not to say we should be flying off to random countries every other weekend, but it's like getting out and seeing new things and like having even like mini adventures should be, I think, like a part of it, of ideally everyone's upbringing. Like get out there and see, even if it's just your own neck of the woods, if you're just camping or hiking or whatever, like get out and do stuff. Like I think that's important and adds a lot of, gives people a lot of perspective the more they get out there and interact with people they usually don't. So yeah, I'm at least now I'm really pumped. Ask me on Monday when I haven't slept after our flight, and my answer might be very different.
Oh, fantastic. Erica, you just posted a question in the comments. Would you like to ask Chris?
Of course. Hey, Chris, thank you so much. I feel like I read your book like the first month it was published, way back in the day. Bought a number of copies actually and handed it out to the team. Very proud of you on this one. I thought it was super relatable, and I was very just impressed with the quality of the stories you were telling. But I had a question that was more about, like, this was published a few years ago, not a crazy amount of time ago, but have you had an adventure after the book was published that you feel like, you know what, sort of wish I had waited to publish that book because this would have been a good story and it did not make it in?
Yeah. I'm trying to think, like, because COVID hit, like that's like this book came out in 2018 and then COVID was the start of 2020. So there's only kind of like a 2-year window in there. And I did go on a bunch of trips. I think like I was at Machu Picchu and did a 7-day hike. And I think I could have like, nothing crazy happened. Like, you know, like compared to what happened in the book. Like nobody died or anything like that. But yeah, I think there was enough. There's like a lot of interesting characters that I traveled with for 7 days. Some more interesting than others. That like, yeah, that could have been. I could have made a story out of that. And also like a story of not going anywhere. Like since COVID hit, I went to TravelCon, which was for 5 days. I flew from here to the US 5 or 6 days, and otherwise I haven't been more than 100 miles from home in like 3 years. So just how that changes you, like how staying still, what you learn and what you sort of have to adapt to, which, not a particularly exciting story, but, it certainly could have found that sort of thoughts could have weaved their way into some other stories. But yeah, nothing super wild yet.
Yeah.
I
just have a follow-up question. Do you believe in the saying, if it's not a good time, it's usually a good story? Because I feel like that's what I thought the whole time I was reading your book.
Yeah, I definitely do. But I also think that like you have to learn to like embrace the bad times when they're happening. Like not just afterwards too, but like when they're happening. There's this old, not to get too philosophical, but this old Zen koan, this old Zen saying is, when it's hot, be hot. When it's cold, be cold through and through. And so just like whatever it is, just like be that. So like even in these stories, when I'm like crapping my brains out on the toilet, like I'm just like laughing away, because I know like this is insane, like this is so silly, like this shouldn't be happening, like and so in not all these stories, some I was just like pissed off and irritated, and like, yeah, they're funny in hindsight. But I try to, when I go out and travel, because that's the thing with travel, like there's, at least for me, and maybe some folks here will agree, like there's traveling and then there's vacationing. And not to say that one is better than the other, but they're two different things. Like vacationing is for resting and relaxing. That's when you're on the beach with the margaritas and reading the book and relaxing, resting, recovering before you get back to real life. Travel for me is putting yourself into potentially unpredictable situations, putting yourself in places where you don't really know all the rules or how things go, and just sort of stumbling through. Like, sure, you look stuff up in advance, and yeah, you can Google things when you need to, but it's not for resting or relaxing, it's for having experiences. And so when you go out with that mindset, like, oh, whatever happens today is part of the trip, then you can sort of tolerate, at least to a degree, more things going off the rails. That's how I think about it anyway.
No, great question. Really good question and good answer. Yeah. Jill has a question about your travel planning process. Jill, would you like to ask?
Well, I'm just wondering how you get your ideas about where to go next. And once you get a seed planted, how do you go about starting to think about what you want to do in that country? And I just think about myself, and sometimes it's a line in a magazine or a chapter in a book, and it just, gee, I want to go there. And how do you start?
Yeah, so these days I've got sort of, for every time I cross something off my bucket list, there's always like 2 or 3 more things that I discover along the way that are added. So yeah, for me, it's inspiration comes from anywhere. Working in the travel industry, I'm always reading about new adventures, but also just like incorporating my interests into my travels, which for me specifically is like long distance hiking. And so looking for places where I can weave that into, so like, where are there long distance hikes? Where are there cheap flights? And where does that sort of cross over? But I'll also just look up the flights. Like on numerous occasions living in Europe, I'll just like go on the website, where's the cheapest flight? It's like $12 to Romania. So I'll just book it and then be like, what can I do in Romania? And then sort of, I'll start by talking to people I know who have been there and getting ideas. And then, yeah, depending on how much time, if there's any films, or if I have more time, books, that I can read. But I think the best thing is to connect with people who have been there, who ideally have kind of the same travel style, because like I could ask someone what they want to do, what they did in Romania, but if they're 22 and love to party, we're going to have very different itineraries. Or if they've just retired, if they're like a retired literature professor from some fancy university, like they're going to give me a different list. So trying to connect with people and get suggestions straight from people who are kind of sort of have similar interests, for me, has always gotten the best results. And then also a big one that I used back in the day was couch surfing, but not to like stay with people, just to ask them like, hey, I'm coming to your city. I see that either, if they like the same music I like or something, I'll ask them like, oh, hey, you like these bands, I love these bands. Like, where should I go to like see music in this city? Or like, what restaurants should I go to? Or, you're into hiking and you live in this city. Like, are there any hikes nearby that I should check out? And just sort of use the social networks that you have to connect with people. Because then once you read blogs and travel guides, those will give you kind of like a framework. And then connecting with people can give you sort of specific tips to kind of point you in the right direction. But yeah, that's generally how I do it.
Good questions and good advice, I think there. Max asked, and I'll just ask this one, Max, to save us time. What triggered your travel? What triggered you to go traveling in the first place?
Yeah, I never I grew up in a small town and spent most of my childhood like growing up farming, and never really had any I liked small town. Like a lot of small town kids were like, oh, this place sucks, I want to leave. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like all my friends are here, I could walk everywhere. I don't mind it. But then yeah, once I went out on that first trip, my first real trip by myself to Costa Rica, then I was like, oh, like there's like a lot of cool stuff out here. Like yeah, Canada's great, but like we don't have like jaguars and stuff. So like, it kind of this stuff when you read it, like, oh, there's a rainforest, cool. But then when you see the rainforest and are in the rainforest, it's a completely different experience. And so, growing up in a small town, there's lots of things I didn't get a chance to do or see or even like think about. So for me, travel was kind of like a secondary education on top of my education, going out and seeing things that I've read about or had never even heard about and wanting to sort of learn more. But yeah, so it was never like my family never traveled as a kid. Like we never did any like big road trips like other families do. We drove to Toronto once a month, like there and back in the same day, which was terrible to see relatives. So, I wish I could say it's like, oh, my parents were like intrepid and like took us on adventures, but it was like kind of the exact opposite. And so I kind of like Matt, like nomadic Matt, like his first trip wasn't until his early 20s. My first trip wasn't until my early 20s. And so it's kind of like this sort of late bloomer travel syndrome is what I call it.
That's the official name now.
Yeah, you can quote me.
I like that. I think that's important as well. I think that's and actually I think that's important to point out that it doesn't matter, does it? You hear about young people who were packed off to another country with their parents to stay with an aunt all summer because their parents had to work, and they already knew their way around their local airport by the age of 11, or something like that, and that has sort of enforced their lifelong love of travel. But actually, I suppose it doesn't need to be that way. You can come at this at any point, however it suits you.
Yeah, and I think like it's never too late, and it's one thing a lot of people will say, especially a lot of folks who are older, like, oh, travel when you're young. I think that's something that everyone has heard. And like, even though I've traveled quite a lot, like more than your average person, I would say, even now, as I've like kind of settled down for COVID, I have a house and a kid now. Even now, I'm like, that wasn't enough. Like that wasn't enough traveling. Like, it's not that I want to jet off right now, but I'm just like, there's still tons of stuff I didn't do and that I'm gonna have to like do now and like drag a kid around and do it, which is totally fine. But like, I think it's never too late to start. And I think you should also travel more than you think you're going to want to, because once you stop, you're going to realize, oh, that wasn't enough. At least in my experience.
Absolutely. I don't know you ever get to a point. I don't know. Maybe time will tell, I suppose. Erica's asked another question. Would you like to ask that to Chris, Erica?
Sure. So, as a travel writer, since you wrote this travel book, right? But also since you're managing the content for Nomadic Matt, you've placed yourself as this like travel expert, I'm sure, among like all the people you talk to. And I just was wondering, what are some common pieces of advice? Because obviously you travel in a way that's, you explain the difference between vacation and travel. And a lot of people can't like unlock that very easily. And they sort of stick to vacations because that's what they know. That's what people around them know. So I assume that people are asking you like how to have cooler travels, or how to travel in a deeper way, or how to experience more on the road. I know that you're, an adventurous guy, and I'm just wondering, like, what are a few pieces of advice that you give to those people that are looking for that deeper experience, or that more exciting, like, international travel experience?
Yeah. So what I generally tell people, and it like point them in the right direction, like here's the websites to find flights, blah, blah, blah. But I think the main thing is like depending on like their personality type, like to start small. Like think about if you've just been vacationing your whole life, again, not that that's bad, but it's different. And you want to get out and travel, you're going to be put into sort of some new and potentially uncomfortable or situations, just like adapting to these things on the road. So like start small, like treat traveling, getting off the beaten path, the same way you would treat other sort of new activities, right? Like if you wanted to run a marathon, you wouldn't just go out and run a marathon, you'd start small. So the same sort of goes with traveling, because it is like a mindset change. Like it's a mindset change, and it requires more patience and a bunch of other sort of personal skills. Like the practical stuff is easy, like finding flights, going to this country, like that's the easy part. Adapting as you go is what's challenging. And so start small. Like don't start with like a 4-month trip around India, or like, cycling from Cairo down to Cape Town or something. If that's not, if you're not already that kind of person, start with like a week in a specific country and cap it. So your first night there is in maybe nicer accommodation, maybe you splash out a little bit, and then you kind of downgrade to something more, maybe a guest house or a homestay or something. And then your last night is back at a hotel where you can sort of rest and recover. That's what I do when I do big hikes. Like the night before I've got a 7-day or 2-week hike, I stay in a hotel, treat myself, and then I have a terrible time hiking for weeks. And then I get back and I'm back in a hotel. I've got hot water and showering. And so it's kind of like you've got this like mental buffer of like, I just got to get through, and then here's the finish line. And so if you can think about your travels in that way, like start small, don't bite off more than you can chew, and then like cap it with something that you'll like. If you love going to spas, or if you love going to whatever kind of thing you're into, that's kind of like your comfort kind of travel, build that into your itinerary so that you have sort of an anchor to keep you steady as you experience all these sort of new situations. That's my advice usually.
I think that's good advice. Yeah, a little bit of familiar, something that's because you can always find, a 4-star Marriott sort of thing, can't you? In any city in the world, just to give you a bit of something that you might think of as you might sort of think of as normal or as comforting. Chris, tell us about the Less Year, your book that's out tomorrow. Just to wrap up things here, let's give everyone something that they can go on and do straight away. Get it ordered.
Yeah, the Less Year is about as far away as you can get from the Dogs of Nam as literarily possible. It is a post-apocalyptic dystopian book with very little travel. It takes place almost exclusively in one small little town village area. It's, you know, very gritty and grim and kind of depressing, some might say. But yeah, I've always loved that sort of genre because it's the opposite of like, you know, it's the opposite of what I do. Like I travel and I write about cool stuff. And so the opposite of that is like horrible end of the world writing, you know? So it's stuff that's, you know, we're not going to experience, knock wood. But yeah, so if you're into, yeah, we'll see, hopefully. But yeah, so if you like dystopian fiction, I think it's definitely worth checking out. It's as my dear colleague Sam said, it's kind of like The Road meets a way better Hunger Games, if that sort of adds some context for folks, which I think is a pretty apt description. Again, not everyone's cup of tea, you know, travel stories that are lighthearted and fun, I think have a much wider audience. This certainly doesn't, but yeah, if you like sort of more gritty fiction for adults, definitely not young adults, then yeah, do check it out. It's out tomorrow. The paperback's available now, actually, and the ebook is out tomorrow. So yeah, feel free to check that out if you're so inclined.
I have just posted the link to that on the chat now, to the Amazon version. It's all if you're not in the US, it'll be at whatever your local Amazon store is. And yeah, share it with people who like that sort of thing as well, please. It's always good to have a recommendation. I think book recommendations are, you know, people don't realize how important they are still, even nowadays.
Yeah, it's when The Dogs of Nam came out, like lots of people were like, oh, this is like hilarious, oh my god, I never know this stuff. And I was like, oh cool, like can you like write that down and like leave it on a review? Like it's great that you told me, but like tell other people. I know it's great. You don't need to tell me that it's great. Like tell the masses, spread the word. Yeah, it is super helpful. You know, for indie authors, reviews are really helpful, and they're just really nice. You know, whenever if I have to get a link for the book and like I can see there's like a new review, it's always like really just like, oh, it's like a nice little treat for the day.
It is absolutely. Chris, thank you so much. This was wonderful. It's been great to talk about your book. I've enjoyed the first few chapters of The Less Year that I've read as well, and look forward to finishing that off.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's Erica, do you have
Yeah, I just want to say I love these book clubs so much because every single month I think about like how when I was a kid I looked at books and I was like, whoa, like I'm never going to know an author. I'm never going to get to talk to one. Like, this is so out of reach. How cool is it that all these people wrote books? Who are these people? I don't know. I'll never know them. And then to meet authors like month after month and to get to talk to them and to realize how regular and relatable and like normal, like how I could pass you on the street and I would never know that you'd written multiple books. Same with you, Luke. And anyone on this call that's been an author, it is just like so utterly inspiring to meet and know people that have done things that felt so unattainable at some point. And so I hope that, you know, I just wanted to share that because I'm always like once a month, I'm utterly present to the fact that like, what a cool thing that now we're adults and now our friends and the people that were showing up to these small book clubs in are like authors, legit authors that are writing books for random people to read across the world. So just like congrats and thanks for being here. And Luke, thank you so much for doing this. Sorry, I don't want to take over your
No, you're so
but
welcome.
I'm just feeling very inspired.
It's always wonderful to be involved in these and yeah, talk about travel and books. Two of my favorite things. So yeah, thanks all round. Have a great rest of your week and I'll see you all soon, I'm sure.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.